All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to week 14. And this week we are in our final module still on the criminal justice system and how it responds to intimate partner violence. This week we're going to kind of take a specialized look at the topics of stalking and homicide and kind of give you an understanding of what stalking is and kind of some of the homicide um, typologies and some of the defense justifications, as well as some of the investigative strategies when investigating homicides. So, as always, I hope you make sure you read chapter 13 and take notes. Again, I won't go into detail on everything in the chapter. This will just kind of be an overview of the chapter and the material that I want you to know. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so let's set up some foundational definitions just so you kind of know what we're going to be talking about. The first is stalking. And stalking is defined as a pattern of repeated or unwanted attention, harassment, contact, or any other course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. Now, stalking has a very different um, type of methodology to it that we'll discuss here in a minute that makes it very special. And then homicide is defined as the killing of a human being by the act, procurement, or omission of another human being. So now that we have the definitions out of the way, let's talk about stalking. Again, stalking is basically following or harassing someone, typically, is what characterizes the offense of stalking. And it is very different from the majority of crimes because it consists of a series of actions rather than a single act. So, stalking, we have to take in all of the acts to kind of define the conduct of stalking instead of just one single act. Like um, killing someone makes up the act of murder, whereas stalking could make up um, several different acts. So it could make up following someone, calling someone repeatedly, showing up uh, where that person is all the time, things like that. So the totality of the actions make up stalking, and that is very different than the majority of crimes that you've studied. When the events are considered individually, they may not constitute illegal behavior, but when they're put together, that's when they constitute the illegal behavior of stalking. So, what are some of the behaviors that we're talking about? So, at the basis of stalking, just like with any other type of intimate partner violence, the offenders routinely attempt to intimidate and control their victims. A significant factor is the stalker's desire to keep the victim within a personal relationship because more than half of stalkers begin before the intimate relationship has actually ended. So that is important. Stalking and the majority of stalking happens within the context of the intimate partner relationship or directly after the relationship is over. Um, we have a sensationalized view of stalking that it's stranger on stranger, and that's not necessarily the case. In fact, the majority of stalker perpetrator victim relationship data shows us that stalkers typically have had an intimate relationship with their victim. The most consistent indicator of violence is threats and a previous intimate relationship between the victim and offender. And common elements in this crime of stalking include following the victim, harassing them, and threatening them. So, all of that typically makes up your stalking behavior. Just like with anything else, we do see stalking and perpetrators of stalking using technology. So we see them using phones or um, bombarding the victims with messaging or utilizing hidden cameras or GPS systems, things like that. And then there are two areas that your book talks about specifically in terms of technology use in stalking, and that's cyber stalking and cyber harassment. We're going to talk about cyber stalking, but cyber harassment is a subsection of cyber stalking. And that's really just looking at the harassment aspect of the stalking behavior. So, cyber stalking has been used to describe a variety of behaviors. So, repeated threats or harassment online. It involves the use of electronic mail or computer based communication, and it would make a reasonable person afraid or concerned for his or her safety. That reasonable person standard is an important standard in most criminal behavior and trying to prove if a crime actually happened. All right, so let's look at some of the victimology of stalking. So we're going to pay attention to the victims aspects and characteristics. So anyone, male or female, can become a victim of stalkers. This person is targeted, has not done anything to provoke the behavior of the offender, and approximately 1.5% of the population between the ages of 18 and older have experienced stalking, which means that you probably know someone who has been a victim of stalking. These crimes often go undetected due to accompanying crimes that may become the focus points. So, stalking and breaking and entering. Police will probably focus on the breaking and entering because it's the more severe crime in their mind. Remember, stalking is a conglomeration of different behaviors that make up stalking. Breaking and entering is just the act itself of breaking and entering. So police would be more focused on that than trying to investigate the forms of stalking, the forms of behavior that make up stalking. So remember, anyone can be a victim of stalking. Uh, Normally, with intimate partner violence, we see females as far as the primary victims when looking at the victimology, but with stalking, anyone can be um, a victim. So now let's turn to our perpetrator dynamics. And your book goes into detail around the four major typologies of stalkers. So the first is the relationship and simple obsessional stalker. This is the most common type of stalker and the one that you're probably think of when we hear of stalker. The perpetrator and victim typically have a previous relationship that could include marriage, friendship, or coworkers. And most stalking cases of intimate partner violence and dating relationships are simple obsessional stalkers. So most of your um, glamorized stalking relationships fit into this simple obsessional stalker. So the next typology is the love obsessional stalkers. These stalkers develop a love obsession or a fixation, generally targeted at celebrities and politicians. The difference between love obsessional stalkers and simple obsessional stalkers is with love obsessional stalkers, there are no previous relationship ties between the victim and offender. So this is like your celebrity crushes that become stalkers. Then you have this typology called erotomania. And this term is usually associated with a stalker who has a severe mental problem, including delusions. They pursue their targets for years. And they actually believe that the victim knows and loves them. So erotomanic stalk, stalkers, sorry, these are very hard words put together. Um, they're delusional. There's the mental health aspect of it. And then finally, the final typology is your vengeance or terrorism stalkers. These stalkers seek to change the behavior of their victim without intending to have any personal relationship with the victim. You see these a lot in political stalkings. They seek to punish their victims for some perceived wrong. So, like I said, you see a lot of these in political um, stalking situations and things like that. But know that the majority of your stalking that you hear about, read about, is going to fall under your simple obsessional stalkers. So, what are some investigative strategies that officers can use when investigating stalkers? So, remember, this stalking is unique because it's a conglomeration of behavior that may not necessarily by themselves be illegal, but when put together is illegal. So, first, you have to assess the victim's credibility. And this is done through observing the conduct of the victim during the investigation. We like to think that everyone who says that they've been victimized truly have been victimized, but it's not always the case. Your book talks about something called false victimization syndrome, and you need to make sure that you read about that. There's been a couple of studies done with some unique kind of factors looking at. There's specifically 5 factors that was looked at in the false victimization syndrome study. But overall, that study found that only a small percentage of crimes reported appear to be false allegations. And motives kind of drive some of the reasoning for why people would have false allegations. So after you've assessed the victim's credibility, then you're going to assess the offender's conduct, investigating basically to determine whether the victim's perception of a threat is accurate. So, do these behaviors together truly warrant stalking? And does it fall into the category of stalking? They typically do this by kind of interviewing third parties and looking at circumstantial evidence. And then finally, officers typically help the victim by obtaining like a restraining order or a no contact order. And we've talked about those. We've also called them temporary protective orders. All right, so that was stalking. And now we're going to turn our attention to homicide. So we know that intimate partner violence can lead to homicide. And so it's important to kind of look at homicides in this context during this week as well. So intimate partner homicide victims make up approximately 11% of all murders nationwide. And there are 3 main categories of homicide in terms of um, intimate partner violence. So the first type is justifiable homicide. And this is killing without evil or criminal intent for which there can be no blame, such as self defense, to protect oneself or protect another, or shooting by a law enforcement officer to fulfill his or her duty. So you've probably heard of justifiable homicide. Next, we have something known as excusable homicide. An excusable homicide is a homicide committed accidentally or with sufficient provocation while doing some lawful activity. Your book goes into talking about battered women's syndrome. And battered women's syndrome falls under the excusable homicide umbrella. Your discussion activity this week is going to kind of help you dive deeper into this battered women's syndrome, and kind of how it's been utilized in the courts as a defense, and kind of have you analyze the pros and cons of battered women's syndrome in terms of it being an excusable homicide defense. And then finally, you have felonious homicide. And this is like your murder, manslaughter, or negligent homicide, um, based on the varying degrees of culpability. So, felonious homicide is the wrongful killing of a human being, um, and it's considered criminal behavior. So those are your main types of homicide. When we talk about homicide, that you've probably heard of if you've taken any type of criminal law class or criminal procedure class. Um, in terms of IPV, there are two kind of more specialized type of homicides that we talk about. The first one is called familicide, and this is a multiple victim homicide incident in which the killer's spouse or ex-spouse and one or more children are slain. We've talked about this when we talked about IPV. Kind of um, familicide is your big umbrella of the partner killing their partner and children. While familicide itself is rare, in approximately one quarter of parent homicide suicide cases, one or more children were also killed. So within familicide, you will see this murder suicide dynamic. Um, so homicide suicide is also considered murder suicide. And this is usually the husband kills his wife or intimate partner and within minutes or hours commits suicide. So if kids are involved, the kids of the perpetrator or the kids of the victim, that is considered familicide. However, if it's just the perpetrator kills his partner and then kills themselves, that is considered homicide suicide or murder suicide. And shootings are the most frequent method of killing in murder suicides. And your book kind of talks about homicides in later life. Um, the spouse of the person over age 80 is the perpetrator in almost 40% of those cases. Firearms, intentional neglect, poisoning, suffocation, and use of blunt instruments are common mechanisms and tools utilized. And typically, death occurs within the victim's homes when we talk about like elder homicide. And then finally, your book talks about homicide investigation strategies that you need to be familiar with. Examination of the area immediately surrounding the body begins the process of the investigation. So when investigators are called to a scene, the first thing they're really going to do is examine the area immediately surrounding that body. Clues within the circle of death aid in the primary steps of determining whether the death was due to homicide, suicide, or attributable to natural causes. So your book has this great diagram of kind of like the circle of death. And so make sure you look at that and kind of know how that is laid out. And finally, make sure you are aware that search warrants are required for the collection of evidence after the emergency response. So you're going to go over a case in which it kind of talks about exclusions to warrants and things like that. Very rare. Um, and there's a lot of myths that float around that you don't have to have search warrants and things for death investigations. However, you do. Those are required for the collection of evidence after the emergency response. All right, so that's going to wrap up this week's kind of lecture. I'm going to upload these slides. You'll also have the publisher slides, which go into a little bit more detail, along with your readings and the videos for this week. Hope everyone has a great week. We are almost done. So this week you're going to be doing these assignments. The following week is Thanksgiving break. I don't assign anything over Thanksgiving break. And then we come back and we have 1 week left. So we are almost there. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out. And wish you the best. Have a great week.